The rain came down in sheets, relentless and unforgiving, hammering the roof of Jack Hollister's barn like it wanted to wash away everything. The night was thick with it, the kind of storm that felt like the earth was trying to bury something. Jack leaned against the far wall, staring out into the dark. His fingers were stiff on the rifle resting in his lap. He'd been waiting for something. What? He didn't know yet. But the feeling had settled into his bones. That kind of stillness before the storm. The real one. Then the phone rang. One sharp, shrill ring that cut through the quiet like a knife. Jack's body tensed, his eyes darting toward the house. It wasn't the kind of call a man expected in the dead of night. Not out here. Not in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. The silence crawled back in after the ring faded. He knew better than to ignore it, but the longer it rang, the more it felt like an omen. Finally, he pushed off the wall, the rifle in his hand now just a weight. He crossed the dusty floor, the wood creaking beneath his boots, and grabbed the receiver with fingers that weren't sure if they were shaking from the cold or something else. "Hello?" His voice was low, but it rang loud enough in the empty barn. The voice on the other end was shaky, broken, full of fear. "I only know one safe place. Your ranch." Jack's grip tightened. The voice was unfamiliar, yet there was something about it, something that didn't sit right. A woman, young, desperate. The words hung in the air like smoke. Safe place? Why her? Why now? He didn't speak at first. He wasn't sure he could. The only sound between them was the storm outside, but it wasn't the rain he was hearing now. It was a pulse in his chest, slow, steady, waiting. "You hear me, Jack?" Her voice cracked, and Jack's pulse skipped. She knew his name. He swallowed hard, staring out through the barn's open door. He could barely make out the silhouette of the distant hills, swallowed up in the downpour. The ranch had been his father's, his grandfather's before him, untouched by the hands of greed. But now this girl, this voice, it felt like something was coming for it, something he hadn't prepared for. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I'm here. Please," she begged. "I need somewhere to go. I need help." Jack gritted his teeth. His fingers were still white-knuckled around the receiver. He could feel the weight of the silence, the way the world outside seemed to hold its breath with him. A feeling crawled up his spine, something cold and familiar. A memory, maybe, or just the way the storm twisted his thoughts. The line went dead. Jack didn't move. His hand stayed wrapped around the receiver for a long time after the last click. His heart was beating too fast, and it wasn't just because of the phone call. It was the way the rain had turned from a background noise to something urgent, like it was calling him too. He set the receiver down. No words left his mouth. Nothing else made sense. For a long moment, he stood there. The storm outside still howling, the barn creaking like it had secrets of its own. Jack looked down at the rifle in his lap, his old partner in solitude. He thought of his father's voice, always so calm when there was trouble. When something comes calling, boy, you face it. He'd said that once, a long time ago. And now, the storm had brought something to his door, something he didn't understand but could feel deep in his bones. He grabbed his jacket off the hook by the door, the fabric stiff from years of wear, and shrugged it on. His boots clicked against the barn floor as he stepped toward the door. The air outside slapped at his face, cold and wet, and the rain was a wall of sound. Jack didn't look back. His hands were steady now. He knew what he had to do, even if he didn't want to. The old truck started with a grunt, and Jack's eyes stayed straight ahead as he pulled out of the barn. The headlights cut through the rain, the only light in the blackness. His mind raced with thoughts he didn't want. Who was she? Why was she coming to him? What kind of trouble was she dragging with her? The storm had him in its grip now, like it had for hours. The road was slick, the wheels sliding slightly as he maneuvered around the curves. The trees stood still, but there was something about the way the wind pushed at them, like they were waiting for something to happen. Jack didn't stop. His hands gripped the steering wheel as the rain kept coming down, harder now, blurring the road in front of him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the storm had been a warning for him to pay attention. The truck rattled down the dirt road, the headlights catching glimpses of something in the distance. He couldn't make out what it was at first, but as the truck neared, the shape of a figure became clear. A woman. She was standing by the road, drenched to the bone, clutching something small in her arms. Jack's heart lurched. The headlights caught her face for a brief moment, and in that instant he saw the fear in her eyes. She was young, barely more than a girl, but the fear in her face aged her. She was waiting for him. Jack slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just inches from her. The rain pounded against the windshield, but he barely noticed it. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was standing still, her shoulders shaking from the cold, her eyes wide and pleading. For a long moment, Jack didn't move. He wasn't sure what to do, but the feeling, the one that had crawled up his spine, told him he had no choice. He opened the door, the storm crashing into him like it had been waiting for this moment, and he stepped out into the cold. "You said my ranch was the only safe place." He didn't know why he said it, but the words left his mouth before he could stop them. She nodded, her voice barely audible over the storm. "It's the only place." Jack stepped toward her, not fully understanding why, but knowing it didn't matter. The storm had brought her here, and now there was no turning back. The ranch had just become something else entirely. The rain was a steady drumbeat, relentless and loud against the truck's roof as Jack steered through the darkened road. The wipers worked in uneven strokes, fighting a losing battle against the sheets of water. The headlights sliced through the downpour, casting pale yellow light onto the road that seemed to stretch forever. The air inside the truck was thick with tension, heavy with the promise of something Jack couldn't name. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. His eyes flicked between the road and the darkness outside. The storm was closing in, the clouds so thick it felt like the world had been swallowed whole. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he was certain something was out there. He felt it. The headlights caught something, just for a moment, a shift in the dark. Jack slammed his foot on the brake, the tires screeching against the slick road. His heart lurched. There she was, a girl. She stood at the edge of the road, soaked to the bone, her back slightly arched under the weight of something, a bundle. She was clutching it close to her chest, her face barely visible beneath the mess of wet hair that clung to her forehead. Jack's truck came to a shuddering stop just a few feet from her. For a second, they both stood frozen. Jack's eyes locked onto hers, wide, terrified, desperate. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was standing, waiting, and something in the way she looked at him. There was no pleading in her eyes, no words, but there was a quiet understanding that settled between them. She wasn't here by chance. She needed him. And the ranch, his ranch, was the only place left for her. Jack couldn't breathe. He threw open the door, the storm rushing in like an animal, cold and biting. The wind nearly knocked him off balance as he stepped out of the truck, his boots slipping on the wet ground. The rain pelted his face, but he barely felt it. His eyes never left her. "You." Jack's voice was rough. "What? What are you doing out here?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, shaking as much as her body. "I don't have much." She took a shaky breath, her grip tightening on the bundle in her arms. "Please, I need somewhere safe." The words landed like a punch to Jack's gut. Safe. He glanced at the bundle. The small shape of a baby, barely visible in the crook of her arm. His heart skipped a beat. He didn't know why. But the sight of the child, so small, so fragile, shattered something in him. The storm raged on, drowning out the sound of his thoughts, but he couldn't pull his gaze away from her. She swayed slightly, her feet planted in the mud, but Jack could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of the storm, the weight of everything she was carrying. He took a step forward, his voice low. "The ranch. You want to come to the ranch?" She nodded, the movement so slight he almost missed it. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but couldn't. The storm swallowed up the silence between them. She didn't need to say anything more. Jack understood. His instincts kicked in, but they were clouded by something else now, a kind of responsibility, like the land itself had already chosen for him. She wasn't some stranger passing through. She was tied to him now. And that child, there was no going back. Jack stepped forward, his boots sinking slightly into the mud, and gently reached out to her. The girl's eyes flicked to his hand, hesitant, but after a moment, she placed her cold fingers in his. Without a word, Jack led her to the truck. Her footsteps were slow, dragging as if she had nothing left to give. He couldn't stop looking at her, at the thinness of her, the way the storm seemed to have seeped into her bones. Her cheeks were pale, the wetness of her clothes clinging to her like a second skin. As they climbed into the truck, Jack carefully adjusted the rear-view mirror. The storm was blinding. The road stretched out in front of them, winding, treacherous. He turned the engine over, the truck's engine sputtering for a moment before catching, and they began to move. He glanced at the girl. Her gaze was fixed out the window, her lips pressed tight. Her eyes were lost in the storm, as if the world outside held her more than the cabin did. "You didn't say your name," Jack said, breaking the silence. She turned to him slowly, her face still streaked with rain. "Emmy." "Emmy," Jack repeated, the name unfamiliar, but it felt like a ghost. "And the baby." "Dylan," she whispered, her voice breaking on the name. "His name's Dylan." Jack's throat tightened. The name hit him like another weight. He swallowed hard. He couldn't bring himself to say anything else. Instead, he focused on the road, on keeping the truck steady as the rain slashed at the windshield. There was something raw about her, something broken that Jack couldn't place. She wasn't asking for much, just safety, just a place to breathe. But Jack could feel the storm she carried with her wasn't just outside, it was inside her too. They drove in silence, the only sound the storm crashing against the truck, the engine's steady hum, and the faint sound of Dylan's breath, small and fragile in the back seat. Jack couldn't help but glance at the bundle again. "The baby. What happened to you?" he asked quietly, his eyes back on the road. She flinched but didn't answer right away. The tension in her shoulders told him she was fighting with something she didn't want to let slip. "I don't have much," she whispered. "Again, just him, just Dylan. I don't have anywhere else to go." Jack's hands gripped the wheel tighter. He didn't know how to fix this, didn't know how to make this better for her, but he knew one thing for sure. The ranch was her last chance, and now it was his too. There was no turning back. The storm raged on, but Jack was driving straight into it, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, not knowing what he would find at the end. The truck came to a halt in front of the cabin, the headlights briefly illuminating the old wooden structure before fading into the storm's embrace. Jack killed the engine, the quiet afterward too heavy. The girl, Emmy, was still clutching the baby to her chest, her hands shaking violently. The rain had soaked her to the core, her hair plastered against her face, her clothes sticking to her thin frame. She looked like she'd been caught in the storm for much longer than she had. Jack didn't speak as he got out of the truck, his boots splashing through the mud. As he made his way to the passenger side, Emmy was staring straight ahead, her face pale, her hands still wrapped around Dylan like he might slip away if she let go. The air felt thick. Jack reached for her door, his hand pausing just above the handle. She didn't move, didn't look at him. "You need to get inside," Jack said, his voice firm. Her eyes flicked up to him, and for a moment, Jack swore he saw something more than fear there. It was a quiet kind of desperation, the kind he'd seen in men who were losing everything. He opened the door, gently but quickly, and reached out. She hesitated, then nodded. She had no strength left to argue. Jack helped her out of the truck, his hand steady on her arm as she stumbled against him. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, as if the weight of the world was pulling her down. She took one slow step after another, each movement a struggle. Jack guided her toward the door, and the storm howled behind them. Inside, the cabin was dark, the only light coming from the embers in the fireplace. The warmth of the fire didn't seem to reach her as she stepped across the threshold, her body a broken silhouette in the dim room. She took one shaky breath and collapsed into the chair by the hearth, the baby still pressed against her chest. Jack watched as she struggled to steady herself, her fingers trembling with every move. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. The silence between them was full of things neither of them could name yet. His eyes lingered on the way she held Dylan, so carefully, so protectively, like she was afraid the world would snatch him away. Jack's hands clenched at his sides. He knew that feeling, the weight of protecting something fragile. He knew it too well, but he also knew the danger of getting too close to something that would break you. She wasn't asking for much, just a place to rest, a place to breathe. Jack's gaze flicked away from her, and he turned toward the woodpile by the door. He grabbed a thick blanket, his motions brisk, almost mechanical. As he approached her, he could feel the old wounds tugging at him, the anger, the bitterness. They were always there, just beneath the surface. "Here." He handed the blanket to her, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, but it sent a strange jolt through him. Her hands were shaking so badly Jack almost thought she wouldn't be able to hold it, but after a moment she took it, wrapping it around herself. The fire crackled in the background, but there was a coldness between them that no warmth could chase away. I didn't know where else to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't look at her. He couldn't. The words sounded so familiar, like a dozen others he'd heard over the years. Everyone came to him when they had nowhere left to turn, and he'd learned to shut off whatever part of him still cared. But now there was something different. He took a step back, his fingers curling into his palms. "You shouldn't be here." The words were harsher than he intended, but they felt right. The bitterness in his voice tasted like old regret, like the things he couldn't fix. She flinched at his tone, her eyes briefly meeting him. There was nothing defiant in her gaze, just exhaustion. "I'm sorry," she said, voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." Jack exhaled, his jaw tightening. He couldn't look at her. He wouldn't. Not with the firelight catching the dampness on her skin, the way the blanket clung to her fragile form. He couldn't feel sorry for her. He wouldn't. But then the baby stirred in her arms, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. The sight of Dylan, so small, so vulnerable, shattered the wall he'd put up around himself. His grip on the cabin door tightened. "You should rest," he said, his voice lower now. "You're not in any condition to be out there in the storm." She nodded, but there was a hollow look in her eyes. Her hands were still shaking as she adjusted the blanket around herself, and Jack couldn't ignore the way her fingers trembled. He turned his back to her, moving toward the window, the rain tapping at the glass like it was trying to get in. He didn't know how long it would last, this quiet, this tension, but he knew one thing. His ranch had always been his solitude, his refuge, and now it was a place for someone else. "You're safe here," he said, the words feeling hollow. The silence between them stretched. She didn't respond, but Jack could feel her presence behind him, the weight of it. She wasn't just looking for shelter from the storm, she was running from something, and Jack wasn't sure if that something would follow her in or stay outside, in the rain, where it belonged. For a moment, Jack felt that familiar anger rise up again, sharp and bitter in his throat. He wanted to shout, to send her away, but the baby's soft whimper cut through the tension. It wasn't just a cry, it was a plea, and Jack couldn't ignore it. His anger flickered and died in the face of that sound. He wasn't going to turn her away. Not tonight. Jack's hand loosened on the doorframe, and he let out a slow breath. The storm was inside, and out there, in the wind and rain, something else was coming. Something Jack couldn't outrun. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. Jack sat in the old armchair by the fire, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the shifting flames. The warmth of the fire couldn't touch the cold that had settled in his chest. His mind was far from the quiet of the room. It was with her, the girl in the other room, the one who had shown up in the middle of the storm. Her name was Emmy. The baby's name was Dylan. He hadn't asked much more, and she hadn't offered it. She was tired. So was he. The only sound in the cabin now was the crackling of the fire and the occasional murmur of her voice. Jack leaned back, rubbing his hand across his jaw. He hadn't slept in hours, but he couldn't seem to pull his eyes away from the flames. It wasn't the storm keeping him awake. It was the girl. The memories she had brought back with her. Memories he'd locked away long ago. He could hear her shifting in the other room. Her faint voice so low he could barely make out the words. She was talking to the baby, soft whispers tender, the way a mother would speak to a child. The baby cried for a moment, that sharp, innocent sound cutting through the stillness. Jack winced at the sound. It was a cry he hadn't heard in years. He forced his mind away from it, but the memory was already there. His family, his wife, his son. Jack closed his eyes, and for a moment, the world around him blurred. He saw their faces again. Their smiles, the way his wife had laughed when she caught him staring at her across the kitchen table. He remembered the feel of his son's tiny hand in his, the warmth of that life, the way everything had seemed right. But it had all crumbled. One lie had cracked the foundation, and everything had fallen apart. The betrayal had cut deep, deeper than anything Jack had ever known. The sound of the baby crying again pulled him back to the present. He couldn't let himself slip any further into that dark place. He couldn't. His eyes snapped open, and that's when he saw it. On the mantel. The envelope partially hidden behind a stack of firewood. It was old, the edges frayed with age. The paper was yellowed and worn, the writing on it fading, but still legible. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He knew that handwriting. It was his father's. He swallowed hard and rose from the chair, his legs stiff as he crossed the room toward the mantel. His hands hovered over the envelope for a moment before he picked it up. The weight of it felt heavy in his hands. There was a strange sense of finality in the action. He didn't want to open it, didn't want to dredge up any more ghosts from the past, but his fingers were already pulling at the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The words were simple, almost too simple, but it was the message that hit him like a punch in the gut. "I didn't do it. You have to believe me." Jack's heart raced as he read it again. His father's words written just before he left, just before everything fell apart. He could almost hear the desperation in his father's voice as he read those words, feeling the weight of the lie his father had buried deep in the dirt of their family's land. The lie that had torn everything apart. Jack's hands shook as he set the letter down. He didn't want to remember, didn't want to feel the betrayal all over again. But it was like a dam had broken, and the flood of memories rushed in. His father's face, the way he'd turned away when Jack needed him most, the silence after his mother's death, the secrets Jack had never been able to uncover. And now, with the girl in the cabin, everything was stirring again. He turned away from the letter, his breath shallow, his chest tight. There was no escaping it. The girl had brought something back with her, something he hadn't wanted to face. Jack's footsteps were heavy as he crossed back toward the fire. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to clear his mind, but the weight of the letter pressed down on him. The girl had no idea who she had stumbled into. No idea that she was in the very place where Jack had buried everything, where the lies had started, where the truth had been hidden. The crackling of the fire filled the silence as Jack stared into the flames. He should have sent her away. He should have sent them both away, out into the storm. But something in him had kept her here. Something in him had seen her fear, her desperation, and he hadn't been able to turn his back on it. Jack exhaled sharply, the words from the letter still echoing in his mind. He couldn't run from the past any longer. He couldn't hide behind the walls he'd built around himself. The girl and her baby were here for a reason, and now Jack was tied to them, whether he wanted to be or not. His father's betrayal had haunted him for years, but now it was like a new chapter was being written, one he couldn't control. Emmy didn't know it yet, but she was in the middle of something much larger than herself. She was tied to him in ways she couldn't understand, and that scared Jack more than anything. He looked over at the door where she sat, her head bent low as she whispered to the baby. Her hands still shook, but her presence in the cabin was steady, like a storm waiting to break. Jack didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to fix it, but he knew one thing for sure. She was here to stay. And the truth was coming with her. The storm outside had settled into a steady rhythm, the rain tapping against the cabin's walls like a constant, persistent whisper. Inside, the fire flickered and crackled, its warmth struggling against the chill that still hung in the air. Jack sat across from her. The girl, Emmy, her hands trembling as she cradled the baby in her lap. The child had fallen asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in quiet breaths, but the weight of the conversation hanging between them was anything but peaceful. Jack's gaze never left her. The silence between them was thick, each of them wrapped in their own thoughts. Emmy shifted in her chair, adjusting the baby as if he were the only thing anchoring her to reality. Jack noticed the way she avoided looking directly at him, her eyes darting to the fire, the shadows, anything but his face. "You're not telling me everything," Jack said, his voice low but firm. She flinched just slightly, but it was enough. Jack could see the flicker of fear in her eyes before she blinked it away. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing inside her. He could feel the tension growing, thickening the air. Her lips parted, and she hesitated, like the words she was about to speak had been rehearsed 100 times before. "I'm running from men," she said quietly, almost too quietly, as if speaking louder would make it more real. "Men who, they won't stop until they find me." Jack's brow furrowed. "What kind of men?" She shook her head, looking down at Dylan, her fingers gently stroking the baby's soft hair. "Men who do bad things. Things that—" She stopped herself, her throat tightening. "I don't know how to explain it. They've been chasing me for weeks." Jack leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You didn't just run from them. You've been running for a while, haven't you?" Emmy didn't answer right away. She looked at the fire, the way the flames danced and shifted, casting strange shadows on the walls. She swallowed hard, then turned her eyes to Jack, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know where to go anymore. They know where I've been. They know my every move. I thought if I came here—" She trailed off, and Jack's gut twisted. Her story didn't add up. It didn't make sense. The way she spoke, the way her words faltered and twisted like she was trying to convince herself more than him, made him uneasy. It was all too neat, too perfect, like a lie wrapped in truth. But still, he couldn't dismiss the fear in her eyes. The way she gripped Dylan like he was the last thing holding her to this world. Jack didn't trust her, but there was something in her story that rang true. She wasn't a stranger to danger. That much was clear. Jack leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're telling me that these men, whoever they are just after you. Just because." She nodded quickly, but Jack could see the hesitation, the shift. In her posture. "They think I know something. I don't, but they think I do." He was quiet for a moment, staring at her, weighing her every word. His mind was racing now, piecing together fragments of her story with what little he knew about her. The girl who showed up at his door in the middle of a storm, the desperation in her eyes, the way she clung to the baby like he was her only salvation. And yet, there was still that nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. Something wasn't right. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. It was loud. It was hard, like someone was pounding on it, desperate. Jack's muscles stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes flicked to the door, then back to Emmy. Her face had gone pale, the color drained from her cheeks. She hadn't moved, hadn't even flinched, but Jack could see the terror in her eyes. She knew what this was. She knew who was on the other side. Jack stood up quickly, his chair scraping against the floor, the sound harsh in the silence. He took a step toward the door, his hand hovering over the handle, his heart pounding. The knock came again, sharper this time, more insistent. "Who is it?" Jack called out, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of the rain pounding against the roof and the crackle of the fire in the background. Then, a voice, low and familiar, rumbled from the other side. "Jack!" The air in the cabin froze. Jack's breath caught, and for a moment, everything inside him went still. He didn't need to hear the rest of the name. He knew. He knew who it was. "Jack," the voice repeated, firmer this time. "Open up. We need to talk." Jack's fingers curled around the door handle, his body rigid. The voice was the last one he ever expected to hear again. The voice of a man who had once been more than a friend. A man who had betrayed him in ways Jack would never forget. Emmy's eyes were wide now, filled with panic. She moved toward Jack, her hands shaking as she reached out to stop him. "Please," she whispered, "don't open the door." But Jack wasn't listening. He couldn't. The past had come knocking, and no matter how much he wanted to ignore it, he knew the truth was on the other side. He opened the door, and standing in the rain, looking more like a ghost than a man, was the last person Jack ever thought would return to this ranch. The man who had once been family. The man who had broken everything. The door swung open to nothing but the night. The pounding rain outside blurred the world into a smear of black and gray, the storm still wailing against the cabin's fragile walls. Jack stepped into the threshold, his heart racing, eyes scanning the darkened yard for any sign of the man who had knocked. But there was nothing, no one, just the sound of the wind, the echo of his own breath, and the steady patter of rain on the roof. He stood there for a long moment, the tension tightening his muscles. The cold air seeped into the cabin behind him, but the chill in his bones had nothing to do with the weather. The knock had stopped, but the feeling it left behind was a weight he couldn't shake. Something wasn't right. His eyes lingered on the darkness outside, the wet ground glistening under the dim light from inside the cabin. He stepped back, closing the door with a soft click, the lock sliding into place with a finality that echoed in his chest. Then something caught his eye. On the floor just inside the door, half hidden in the shadow, was something small and metallic. Jack bent down, his hand hovering over the object for a moment before he picked it up. It was a badge, old, tarnished, its edges worn, its shine dulled by years of neglect. The emblem was unmistakable, the family crest, the symbol that had once been proudly displayed in the sheriff's office, the same badge his father had worn when he was the law, when he was someone Jack had once looked up to. Now it was nothing but a reminder of betrayal. Jack's grip tightened around the badge, his fingers curling into a fist as the memories came rushing back, unbidden and sharp. His father's voice, the way he'd always carried that badge with pride, the way he'd stood tall behind it. But the pride had turned to dust long ago. The badge had been a symbol of something honorable once, but now it was a relic of everything Jack had tried to escape. He stood frozen, staring down at it. The weight of it in his hand was a physical thing, heavier than it had any right to be. His chest tightened, his breath shallow as the truth began to unfurl in his mind. The girl, Emmy, she was tied to this, to his family's past, to everything he had buried and thought he could leave behind. She wasn't just running from some nameless men. She was running from the very people who had once owned this land, the same people who had torn Jack's world apart, the same people who had destroyed his family. Jack's fingers trembled, the badge slick and cold in his hand. His mind raced. The men who were chasing her, the men she spoke of with fear and desperation, were the very same ones who had once stood alongside his father. They had been in bed with each other, blood brothers in their own way. And now, they were coming for the girl who had somehow been caught in their game. His father had been complicit. No, more than that. He had been a part of it all. Jack had been too young to see the darkness back then, too naive to understand the games his father played. But now the pieces were falling into place. Everything, the lies, the secrets, the corruption, was connected. Jack's breath quickened as the reality of it all settled in. Emmy hadn't just stumbled into this mess by chance. She was tied to him, tied to the past he had tried to outrun. And now she had dragged it all back to the surface. He closed his hand around the badge, squeezing until his knuckles turned white. The old family emblem, now stained with blood and betrayal, felt like a weight around his wrist. He was stuck in the past, tied to it in ways he couldn't escape. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that had just been unleashed inside him. Jack's pulse raced. He wanted to throw the badge in the fire, to burn away the memories, to erase the connection. But he couldn't. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something he couldn't control. Emmy's arrival had reawakened something inside him, something dark and dangerous that he had tried to keep buried. He took a deep breath and turned, walking back toward the hearth. The fire had burned low, the embers crackling faintly in the quiet room. He stood there for a moment, staring into the dying flames, feeling the weight of the badge in his hand. The silence between him and Emmy stretched, the tension thick as smoke in the air. She was in the other room, still holding Dylan close, her voice barely a whisper whenever she spoke to him. Jack hadn't said anything to her yet, hadn't told her what he had found, but he couldn't ignore the truth now. The ties between them were deeper than he had thought. The men chasing her weren't just strangers. They were a part of his past, his father's past, and by extension, they were a part of his. He clenched his fist around the badge, the sharp edges digging into his palm. The truth was staring him in the face. And it wasn't just about the girl anymore. It was about everything he had tried to forget. The sound of Emmy's voice, fragile and distant, broke through his thoughts. Jack? He turned toward her. Her figure was silhouetted in the dim light from the other room, her face pale, her hands shaking as she held Dylan. The baby was awake now, his tiny hands gripping at her shirt. Jack took a step toward her, the badge still clutched tightly in his fist. He didn't know how to explain any of this, didn't know how to tell her the truth. But he knew one thing for certain. The past was here, and it wasn't leaving without a fight. "Emmy," he said, his voice rough, "we need to talk." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. Jack could see the terror in her face now, the same terror that had been there when she first arrived. And for the first time, Jack wasn't sure if he was the one she was running from. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the sprawling fields, painting the land in soft shades of gray and gold. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered in the heavy air, the ground slick with rain, and the wind still carrying the scent of earth and moisture. Jack stood at the edge of the ranch, his boots sinking slightly into the mud as he stared out at the horizon. The land stretched out before him, endless and silent, a quiet reminder of everything he had inherited. For as long as he could remember, the ranch had been everything to him. It was more than just land. It was independence. It was freedom. It had been the one thing he could control, the one thing that had survived the storms of his past. It had been a symbol of his father's strength, of his family's resilience. But now, standing here, with the weight of the badge in his pocket and the girl and her child inside, it felt different. The ranch wasn't just a place of refuge anymore. It was a battleground, and Jack wasn't sure if he was fighting for the land anymore. He was fighting for something else, something he wasn't sure he even wanted. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him. The land was his inheritance, yes, but it was more than that now. It was a chain, an anchor pulling him deeper into something he couldn't escape. He wasn't just protecting the land anymore. He was protecting a future he never thought he'd have, a future that included a woman and child he had never imagined would walk through his door. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and wet grass. Jack's fingers flexed at his sides, his body tense as he surveyed the fields. The horizon was the same as it had always been, the land stretching out in front of him like a never-ending road. But the future, his future, had just become something uncertain, something he wasn't sure he could control. He couldn't shake the feeling that the ranch, his family's legacy, was no longer just his. The girl, Emmy, had come into his life like a storm, and now the storm had settled, leaving destruction in its wake. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The ranch would never be the same again. Jack took a deep breath, his chest rising with the air, his eyes still fixed on the land before him. The fields were empty, the silence around him deafening. He had spent years alone out here, working the land, carving out a life from the earth. But now, the land was speaking to him in ways it never had before. The earth beneath his feet felt different. He felt different. The sound of footsteps behind him snapped him out of his thoughts. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "You're up early." Emmy's voice was soft, hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she was interrupting something important. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another long look at the land, trying to make sense of everything swirling in his mind. The baby's soft coo echoed in the distance, and Jack couldn't help but glance over his shoulder. She was standing in the doorway of the cabin, the early light casting long shadows across her tired face. Her eyes were tired, but there was a softness to them now, a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. "I couldn't sleep," Jack finally said, his voice low and rough. "You've been up since before dawn," Emmy said, stepping closer to him. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Jack's gaze flicked to her, and for the first time, he saw the uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't just asking about the land. She was asking about him, about the decision he had made to let her stay. He didn't know what he wanted anymore. The ranch had always been his life, his future, but now, with her here, with Dylan here, everything felt different. "I don't know," he muttered, his gaze shifting back to the horizon. The ranch had always been his, but it was more than that now. It was a tether, a connection to the past, a past he couldn't outrun. The land had been his salvation, but now it was a prison, and he was the warden. "I'm not asking for anything," Emmy said, her voice small but steady. "I just don't want to make things harder for you." Jack's heart twisted at the sincerity in her words. She was afraid of being a burden, of imposing on him. But the truth was, it wasn't her he was afraid of. It was the weight of the choices he'd made, the way his life had been twisted by things he couldn't control. The silence between them stretched, the only sound the wind moving through the grass. Jack's eyes drifted back to the cabin, where the warmth of the fire still flickered inside. He had spent so many years alone holding on to this ranch like it was the only thing that mattered. But now it wasn't just the land that mattered, it was her. "I don't know what I'm doing," Jack admitted, his voice rough. "This land, this ranch, it's everything I've ever known, but now it feels like a weight." Emmy stepped closer, her fingers grazing his arm. "You're not alone anymore." Jack closed his eyes at the feel of her touch, the warmth of it grounding him. He wasn't alone. He hadn't been alone in a long time, but the weight of the responsibility, the past, and the future, all of it was closing in on him. The ranch had always been his fortress, but now it felt like it was closing in on him too. He opened his eyes, staring out at the fields once more. The land stretched out before him, but the path ahead was unclear. The future, once so certain, was now a road filled with uncertainty. But there was one thing he knew. The ranch was no longer just his, and he didn't know how to walk that road alone anymore. "I'm not sure what to do," Jack said softly, his words hanging in the air between them. "You don't have to do it alone," Emmy whispered. For the first time in years, Jack felt the weight of the ranch shift, like the earth beneath him was no longer just soil and stone, but something far more alive, something far more dangerous. And as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the fields, Jack knew that the life he had built here, his inheritance, his independence, wasn't just a future to protect. It was a future to fight for. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but inside Jack, something colder was stirring. The storm had passed, but a new kind of pressure was building, one that had nothing to do with the weather. Emmy sat across from him, her eyes downcast, the weight of her next words hanging heavy in the air. Dylan was asleep in her arms, oblivious to the tension in the room. Jack couldn't tear his eyes from her, from the way she held him, so protective, so desperate for safety. But that desperation was beginning to feel like a lie. She had been quiet for too long. Jack had given her space, given her time to settle, but he knew now that the silence wasn't peace. It was fear. "Jack," she began, her voice barely more than a whisper, "there's something you need to know. About me. And about my mother." Her words cut through the air like a blade, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. He had been waiting for this, but he hadn't known how much he was bracing for it. "What about your mother?" Emmy's eyes flicked up to meet his dark circles beneath them, a haunted look in her gaze. "She was your aunt. She was taken from this ranch, Jack." The words hit him like a physical blow. Jack's chest tightened, and for a moment, the room felt like it was closing in on him. "What the hell are you talking about?" His voice was low, sharp, but the tremor in it betrayed him. "My mother was your aunt, Jack. The woman who disappeared all those years ago. They told everyone she left, but she didn't. She was taken." Her voice broke, and she took a shuddering breath before continuing. "She was part of this place, part of your family's bloodline. And now it's come for me." Jack's blood ran cold. He stood up quickly, his legs unsteady beneath him. "You're saying my aunt, she... what?" He couldn't make sense of it. His mind spun with 1,000 different questions, but they all collided in a whirlwind of confusion. Emmy stood up too, her hands trembling as she placed Dylan gently on the chair. "I know it's hard to believe, but your family, the Hollisters, they were part of something dark. I don't know all the details, but I know my mother was part of it. She uncovered something your father—" She trailed off, her voice faltering, but Jack didn't miss the look of fear that crossed her face. "My father? What the hell did my father have to do with this?" Jack's voice cracked with anger, and the tension in his chest threatened to spill over. He knew Jack. He knew about the things that happened here, the things that are still happening, but he didn't stop them. He just covered them up. Jack's stomach churned, the bile rising in his throat. His father had never been perfect, but Jack had always believed he was a man of integrity, a man who had held his head high in a town that demanded respect. The ranch had been his pride, his legacy, but now it felt like a prison, a place built on lies. "Your father's sins are the reason I'm here," Emmy said quietly, her voice trembling. "He made sure my mother disappeared. He didn't want the truth to get out." Jack's heart raced as her words hit him. The pieces were falling into place now, too fast, too violently. His father, a man who had been so cold, so distant, had been hiding something terrible, something dark that had been passed down through the years, a family secret that hadn't stayed buried. "I don't believe you," Jack muttered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. He clenched his fists, fighting the truth that was clawing at him. But the fear in Emmy's eyes was undeniable, and a part of him knew she wasn't lying. He had known there was something wrong with the past, something he could never quite understand. But now it was all coming to the surface, and the flood of realization was overwhelming. Emmy stepped closer, her gaze steady. "You don't have to believe me, but I've been running from the people who did this for too long. They know where I am. They know who I am. They want me because I'm the last one left to uncover the truth. Your family's legacy is tied to this, Jack. It's tied to my mother's death. And now, it's tied to me." Jack's breath caught in his throat. He had thought he was protecting the ranch, his legacy, his past. But now he realized that his past wasn't what he thought it was. The ranch had never been a safe place. It had been a cage. And Emmy wasn't just some stranger. She was part of it. She was part of the darkness his family had created. "I didn't want this," Emmy said, her voice breaking. "But I don't have a choice. I've come here because I have nowhere else to go. But they'll find me, Jack. And when they do, they'll come for you too." Jack's mind spun. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. The weight of the truth settled on him like a heavy stone, pressing him down. His father's mistakes, his own blood, had brought this onto him. The ranch wasn't just a piece of land. It was a battleground, and he was stuck in the middle of a war he never wanted to fight. The silence between them was thick. Jack's gaze drifted to the mantel, where his father's old things still lay, untouched by time. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to face the truth. But he was standing at the edge now, and there was no turning back. "Get out," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "I need to think." Emmy's eyes filled with unshed tears, but she didn't argue. She turned, her hands shaking as she picked up Dylan. The weight of her presence lingered in the air, but Jack couldn't move. He just stood there, staring at the place where his family's past and his future collided. The door closed behind her, and the room felt emptier than it ever had before. Jack's hand shook as he turned toward the window, looking out over the land that had always been his. But now it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. The ghosts of the past were rising, and Jack knew there was no escaping them. The night had settled, heavy over the ranch, the darkness broken only by the flickering light of the fire in the cabin. Jack sat in the corner, his eyes scanning the shadows beyond the window. The storm had passed, but something else lingered in the air. A tension like the calm before a storm that wasn't finished yet. The wind howled softly through the trees, but it was the silence inside the cabin that unsettled him. Emmy was across the room, cradling Dylan, her face a mixture of exhaustion and fear. Jack didn't need to ask what she was thinking. She was waiting for the storm to come too, waiting for whatever had been chasing her to find them. He didn't know how much longer they could hide. The ranch had been his fortress for years, but now it felt more like a trap. The very land he had fought to protect was now the place where everything was crumbling around him. The first sound came from the far corner of the property. A crack, followed by a rustle, something moving through the underbrush close to the barn. Jack's heart skipped. "Did you hear that?" Emmy's voice was barely above a whisper. Jack's hand clenched around the rifle he'd set beside him. "Stay quiet," he said, his voice low. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, the shadows outside closing in. He wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was protecting everything, the ranch, his future, and the ghosts of his past that had come knocking. Another noise, closer this time, a soft footfall on the gravel. "They're here," Jack muttered. His eyes flicked to Emmy, who was still holding Dylan tightly, her face pale. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What do they want?" Jack didn't answer right away. He knew exactly who they were. Men from his father's past, men tied to the land, men who had been part of the same corruption Jack had spent his life running from. And now they were back, hunting Emmy, hunting the truth. And Jack had no choice but to face it. "They're here for you," Jack said, his voice thick with regret. "But they won't leave without something from me, too." A sharp knock came at the door, followed by a low, gruff voice calling out, "Jack?" Jack's heart clenched. He didn't recognize the voice, but it carried a weight of familiarity. He knew these men. They were the same ones who had shadowed his father's life, the same ones who had stayed in the background, pulling strings in the town, in the ranch. Jack had thought they were ghosts, but ghosts never stayed dead. Emmy looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "What are we going to do?" Jack's breath came in shallow bursts as he stood up, the rifle in his hand now steady. The ghosts were no longer just memories. They were here, pressing in on all sides, and they were taking everything Jack had left. "They want something from me," Jack said, his voice quiet but resolute. "And I'm going to make them take it from me, not from you." Before she could respond, the door creaked, the lock groaning as if the ranch itself was protesting what was about to happen. Jack's hand shot out, his fingers closing around the door handle. The door burst open, the night pouring into the room like a wave. Shadows moved quickly, merging into one. Jack fired a shot, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, but it didn't stop them. More footsteps followed, quick and sharp, pressing in from all directions. The rifle kicked in his hand, but Jack didn't hesitate. He fired again, the bullet tearing through the night air, the sound of it echoing in his bones. "Get back," he shouted to Emmy. She flinched, but she didn't run. She stayed close to Dylan, holding him tight against her chest as the tension in the room thickened. Jack could feel her eyes on him, but he couldn't focus on her right now. His world was the men outside, the shadows pressing closer. He wasn't just defending the ranch anymore. He was defending everything he had left, the life he had built, the legacy he had inherited, and the woman and child who had somehow found their way into his world. More voices now, muffled, but the anger in them was palpable. "We know you're in there, Jack." The voice was familiar, like it had come from the past, from a time Jack had tried to forget. "Come out, or we'll bring it all down." "Not today," Jack muttered, his fingers tight around the rifle as he crouched by the window, his eyes scanning the dark yard. The tension was suffocating now, the silence before the storm even more deafening than the crash of the rain. His heart raced, the adrenaline pumping in his veins. His father had never fought these men. He had let them have their way with everything, let them bend the rules, hide the truth. Jack wasn't his father. He wasn't going to let them win. Not here, not now. Jack moved, his feet light as he stepped into the next room, positioning himself at the back door. He could hear the men outside, their muttered curses growing louder, but there was something else in their voices. A fear, a recognition. They didn't expect him to fight back. They thought he would hide behind the land, behind the walls of his father's mistakes. But Jack wasn't hiding anymore. "Get to the back," he said, his voice sharp. "I'll hold them off." Emmy looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but she nodded. Slowly, carefully, she moved toward the back door with Dylan in her arms, her face set in determination. The door rattled again, this time harder. Jack knew they were close, too close. He raised his rifle, his mind racing, and in that moment, he realized the truth. This ranch was no longer just his inheritance. It was his fight, his redemption, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. The door splintered. Jack fired again. This time, the shadows were gone, but they weren't finished. Neither was he. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ranch. The quiet of the evening was broken only by the distant calls of birds, the rustling of the wind through the trees, and the pounding of Jack's heart. He stood in the middle of the yard, his hands shaking as he gripped the rifle, the weight of it a constant reminder of the choice he was about to make. The ranch, his inheritance, his past, stretched out before him, silent, waiting. It had always been his shield, his fortress. But now it felt like a prison, a place built on lies, betrayal, and the sins of his family. He could feel the weight of generations pressing down on him. The legacy of his father, of his grandfather, was tied to this land. The ranch was more than just a piece of property. It was a symbol of everything Jack had ever known, everything he had ever fought for. But now, that symbol was tainted. The past was no longer something to be proud of. It was a ghost, haunting him at every turn. The girl, Emmy, stood across from him, her arms wrapped tightly around Dylan, her face pale and tense. She was watching him closely, her eyes searching for him, like she was waiting for him to make the move that would define them both. Jack could feel it, the pull between what was right and what was expected. On one side, there was the ranch, the family name, the legacy. To protect those things would mean keeping everything he had ever known intact. But on the other side, there was her. The girl who had come into his life like a storm. The girl who was tied to the darkness of his past. She had become everything he once despised. She was a reminder of the things Jack had tried to bury, the things he had never wanted to face. But at the same time, she had become a symbol of something else, something he hadn't realized he was capable of fighting for. "Jack," Emmy's voice was soft but insistent, breaking the silence. "You have to choose." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy, like a warning. She didn't need to say more. Jack knew what she meant. The time for running was over. The time for hiding behind the ranch, behind the name, had passed. It was time to decide. Jack's grip tightened on the rifle, his knuckles white. The weight of it felt different now. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in. But the more he held it, the more it felt like a burden. "I don't know if I can do this," Jack muttered, more to himself than to her. "I've spent my whole life protecting this place, protecting my family's name. I can't just throw it all away." Emmy stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "You're not throwing it away. You're choosing something else. You're choosing the future." Our future. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He didn't want to look at her. He didn't want to see the pleading in her eyes, the hope that she had placed in him, but he couldn't tear his gaze away. She was right. If he chose her, if he chose to protect her and Dylan, he would be throwing everything away, the ranch, the legacy, the name. But if he chose to protect the ranch, he would be sacrificing everything he had just begun to understand. He would be condemning her to the same fate that had already claimed his family. "You don't know what you're asking me to do," Jack said, his voice rough. "This ranch, it's all I've ever had." "I know," Emmy replied quietly, "but it's not just yours anymore. You have a choice, Jack. And I'm asking you to make it. For me. For Dylan. For yourself." Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced back at the ranch, the house, the barn, the fields, everything that had been his life, his past, his everything. But the more he looked, the more it felt like it was slipping away from him. He could see his father's face in his mind, stern, unforgiving, always holding the ranch above everything else. Jack had been raised to believe that this was his duty, that the land was his responsibility. But what had that gotten him? The land had never protected him. It had never been a place of peace. It had been a place of power and control, a place of lies. And now, standing at the edge of it all, Jack realized that the ranch wasn't a symbol of strength anymore. It was a symbol of everything he had lost, everything he had buried. His hands shook as he lowered the rifle, the weight of it suddenly too much to bear. "What do you want me to do?" Jack asked, his voice raw. Emmy didn't hesitate. "I want you to fight. I want you to fight for us. Fight for the future. For Dylan's future. The past is gone, Jack, but the future is still ours to choose." Jack's heart thundered in his chest as her words sank in. He wasn't just fighting for her. He wasn't just fighting for Dylan. He was fighting for himself, for the man he could be, for the life he could have. He wasn't sure if he could win. He wasn't sure if he could protect them both and keep the ranch. But one thing was clear. He couldn't protect anything if he didn't choose to fight. He took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. And for the first time, he knew what he had to do. "I'm not running anymore," Jack said, his voice steady now. "I'm going to fight for you, for us." Emmy's eyes softened, and a small, hopeful smile played at the corners of her lips. Jack looked back at the ranch one last time, the weight of it still heavy, but no longer suffocating. This was his fight now. The future, whatever it may hold, was his to decide. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind only the stillness of the night. The rain had washed the earth clean, but the tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Jack stood in the doorway of the cabin, his hand resting on the handle of the rifle slung across his shoulder. Emmy stood beside him, her eyes locked. On the horizon, where the ranch gates loomed in the distance, the same gates that had once been the boundary of everything he had fought for. Now they felt like a threshold, one he couldn't cross without losing everything. "Are you sure about this?" Emmy's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. Jack didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse of land before him. The ranch, his inheritance, was no longer just a piece of land. It had become a battleground for his soul, the place where everything he had ever known was about to be torn apart. "I don't have a choice," he replied, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth he had been running from. The land was no longer his protector. It was his prison. And now, with the girl walking beside him, his future was tied to hers, to the choices she had forced him to make. He looked back one last time, taking in the sight of the cabin, the place that had been his refuge, his sanctuary, but now it felt like a ghost. The walls, the land, the name, everything was slipping through his fingers. "Let's go," Jack said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside him. Emmy nodded, her steps slow but purposeful. They walked together, the sound of their footsteps the only noise in the quiet of the night. The wind had died down, but the night still felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. As they approached the gates, Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what was waiting on the other side. He didn't know if he could protect her, if he could protect anything at all. But he knew one thing. He couldn't keep running. The lights from the cabin flickered behind them, the last remnants of their past fading into the distance. The gates stood before them, silent, as if they were the last barrier between the man he had been and the man he was about to become. Jack turned to Emmy, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in what felt like forever. "You ready?" She nodded, her face set with determination, but there was something else in her eyes. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something Jack recognized. the same thing that had brought her here in the first place, the will to survive. Together they stepped forward. The night swallowed them whole, and with it all the choices they had yet to make. The last of the attackers crumpled to the ground, his body falling in a heap of shadow and dust. The crack of gunfire still hung in the air, but the night had settled into a strange, suffocating silence. Jack stood over the fallen men, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his fingers still clenched around the rifle. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only a hollow, aching emptiness. He looked out over the ranch, the land that had been his life, his legacy. The firelight from the cabin flickered faintly in the distance, casting long shadows across the field. The storm was long gone, but the chaos it had brought would never leave. The ranch, once a symbol of everything Jack had worked for, was now a battleground, a place where everything he had ever known had been torn apart. The girl and her child were safe inside, tucked away from the violence that had threatened to consume them all. Jack had protected them, yes, but in the process, he had lost more than he had gained. The ranch, the land, the future he had once thought was his to control. None of it belonged to him anymore. Jack stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale, uncertain light over the horizon. The quiet was almost unbearable, and in it, Jack could hear the distant echoes of everything he had fought for. The land had been his shield, his identity, but now it was a reminder of the choices he had made, the price of protecting something that had never truly been his. He couldn't keep pretending that the ranch was his alone, that the past hadn't already changed everything. Jack's fingers brushed against the rifle and he lowered it, his gaze fixed on the ground beneath his feet. The earth, the land, everything he had once thought of as his birthright was now something different. It was a battleground. He turned, slowly, and walked toward the cabin. The girl and her child were waiting inside, safe for now. But Jack knew the truth. The future was uncertain, and the ranch would never be the same. As he reached the door, he paused for a moment, taking one last look at the land. The sun was rising higher now, casting light on the dust and the broken remnants of the night's fight. The future, though uncertain, was his to shape. He stepped inside, his heart heavy with the realization that he had let go of the past. The land, the legacy. None of it belonged to him anymore, but he wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. The future was waiting, and Jack was finally ready to face it.